Earlier, we were talking about Curt Cignetti, the job that he's doing right now. Football, I said this earlier, for things that I would put out or tweet, whatever, football just never moved the needle. And right now, virtually everything that you put out is that needle is popping. There's hope by the Indiana fans, which is, I love seeing that from them, because they have, if there's any fan base that deserves the right to go, yeah, I believe it when I see it. But that hasn't been the case. They've seemed to really be getting behind this hire, getting behind what he's doing. And there's a lot of optimism for fans. And I'm not saying that they should be optimistic of going 9-3 and winning yada, yada right now next season. But the fact that there's optimism, I'm happy for them to see that. It's fun to see that. And it's going to be interesting, because I think he is doing a good job at what he is getting to where he wants to be.
Yeah, I mean, listen, these are the easiest days in a coach's tenure in some respects. You haven't really lost a recruitment yet. You certainly haven't lost a game yet. Obviously, they're not easy in terms of everything you've got to do. And it seems like he and his staff are covering a lot of ground pretty quickly. I would say, I think in a weird way, that this time has, I want to say it's gotten easier for coaches, but I think the whole part, with transfers and kids having to move so quickly through that process, I think everything does get a little more streamlined. You're able to just say, hey, why don't you come to our campus? There's a little bit less like, oh, we're going to get out to all these practices and all these in-home visits, although they're doing those too. But like, there's also just a lot of like, hey, we got a kind of a home base here, and we're just going to be bringing a lot of transfer recruits through. They're probably going to visit 3-4 different schools in the space of, a week and a half. So we're just going to kind of keep running them through. And it doesn't seem like they're overly sort of, what is the word I'm looking for? They are overly sort of, publicizing, I guess. They're just, I mean, we're picking up on these visits because the kids are tweeting about them, not because anybody's sort of trying to say, oh, look at all these visitors, whatever. It seems like Cignetti and his staff really only kind of get on social media when stuff has happened and sort of talk about that. Obviously the Curtis Rourke commitment last week, and some others, but, or not last night, like yesterday afternoon, sorry. But it's just, I mean, it's, this is a time when a coach has a lot of momentum, and it seems like Cignetti and his staff are using it. I mean, the Rourke commitment, frankly, was getting a lot of positive play yesterday outside the Indiana bubble. And, I'm not going to sit here and say, I'm done knowing what's a sure thing and what's not in college athletics, whether it's coaching hires or transfers or whatever. But it just does seem like they've got the momentum. They know they've got the momentum, and, they're using it.
Absolutely. And it's going to be interesting to see how that continues, and to see which guys decide to still come back that are in the portal for Indiana. I think the most important name right now would probably be Donovan McCully.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, I mean, everybody can kind of speak for themselves. I think McCully is, personally, I think McCully is on the verge of being really, really good. And I think he is, you saw over the back part of last season, I forget what the exact numbers were, but those last 5 games where he really kind of turned it on. If you took his numbers, and this is an imperfect science because obviously those last 5 games, none of them were against Michigan, Ohio State, etc. But if you took his numbers from those 5 games and you played them out across the course of a 12-game season, he would have had a 1,000-yard season. He would have had 12 touchdowns, and all of his catches, yards, and scores would be top 3 numbers in the Big Ten this year. And again, that's imperfect. You can't sit here and say, oh, that's exactly what he would have done. But the point is, that's the kind of talent he showed. That's the kind of, we had been waiting since he moved from receiver or from quarterback to receiver, and Tom Allen and others talked so much about, they thought, They believed he could be such a good receiver. He just kind of needed to figure out where his ceiling was. And we kept kind of waiting for that to happen. And it did feel like it clicked. And I'm not even trying to take anything away from Brendan Sorsby, but I thought that it was noticeable that Sorsby's, leap, if you want to say, in the season really seemed to coincide with having a legitimate number one target in Donovan McCully that he could go to a lot in some of those games where he put up big numbers. So if they can get McCully back, and my read of it is that there may be more of a chance of that now than I would have thought there was at the beginning of this week. Michigan's involved, Texas A&M. I don't know if this is true or not, but I think Notre Dame has certainly been floated. I think some other Southern schools, even maybe ones that he hasn't publicized, or maybe they haven't offered, but they've at least kind of checked in on him. If you could get him back, I mean, he's I think 24/7 Sports has him as the number 10 receiver in the transfer portal. That's, if you pulled that player with those numbers out of the portal from Vanderbilt,
Arizona State or wherever.
Yeah, like you'd be like, and then you watched his film, you'd be like, that's a really promising player. Indiana might be able to do something there. Keeping him, if they can, would be a real shot in the arm next season.
Well, and landing Curtis Rourke, the quarterback from Ohio, that is a veteran quarterback, as a matter of fact, and has one season left of eligibility, but he's a guy that has thrown for nearly 8,000 yards in his career, 50 touchdowns. That is probably something that Indiana needs to land him back.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly doesn't hurt. I think I saw something like, I think Rourke had something like a 90 plus grade on Pro Football Focus the last 2 years. Obviously, he tore his ACL at the end of the 2022 season. He was still able to come back and be pretty productive this year from that. But I think it's always going to help if you're recruiting a higher level receiver, or in this case, maybe re-recruiting is probably the better way to put it. It's always going to help if you can kind of say, well, we know the quarterback that you really kind of built that sync up with, that chemistry with last year's gone, but this is the guy we're bringing in, and here's our history. Curt Cignetti and his staff have a pretty good history with transfer quarterbacks in particular. I think they had multiple transfer quarterbacks win Sun Belt Player of the Year or at least Conference Player of the Year during their time at James Madison. So suddenly, that sales pitch becomes a little bit more real and a little bit more sort of clear cut. And, if you're Indiana, I think that the best you can do, you've got some NIL resources. I am confident that Indiana has put some pretty substantial NIL opportunities on the table for Donovan McCully. That doesn't necessarily guarantee it. Other schools might do it too. But this is the other thing you find with, kids now is a lot of guys enter the portal because they want to know what their value is. They want, it's a risky thing, sure, but they want to know what's out there. And you might get, and this is total hypothetical. Please understand that. This is not me sort of saying out loud what someone has whispered to me privately. But you might get a situation where, Indiana is offering, you're going to be our number one receiver. We're going to pay you X dollars, and we're going to guarantee you that if you're healthy, you're going to have just an absolute leading role in our offense. And Penn State, is a team that's offered McCully. I don't think he's visited State College at this point, unless it happened privately. Penn State might say, hey, you can come play at Penn State and, have more of a chance of a Rose Bowl or a Cotton Bowl or whatever. But it's less money in terms of NIL opportunities, and you're going to be competing with three other guys to, for one of those top two boundary spots. And so suddenly maybe McCully says, well, I might actually give Indiana a little bit more of a try. It's always a sliding scale, I guess, is kind of my point. It's not necessarily – I think we all feared that NIL might just mean the big teams got to stockpile all the talent. And I think what's happened is, as schools that weren't just naturally going to build an NIL war chest, Ohio State fans being like, yeah, we just want to win. Whatever it takes to win. We'll just, football's our priority. And I think you're seeing this a little bit more in the other direction for schools like Indiana in basketball, where maybe Indiana's NIL sort of advantage was greater before other schools started to figure out how to filter that money down, so to speak, football schools. But I think what we are seeing in fairness is that as maybe some of the schools that needed a little bit more time to figure out how to build those NIL resources out have been able to do that, suddenly it's not as simple as saying, well, Michigan offered, so I'm leaving. I'm out of your league now. I think that listen, McCully may not come back. This is not me saying it's locked in, it's guaranteed, no question. But it is something where I think, what you're seeing a little bit is as NIL resources at schools like Indiana have expanded, suddenly, you're not going to beat the Alabamas and the Michigans for players they absolutely want, but you might be able to be a little bit more appealing to players that might be looking at those schools and saying, yeah, the name value is great, but what's my role? What are my opportunities? Am I going to get buried in the depth chart? Is there, just to be frank, is there more money going back the other way? So